Rome, January 17, 1979. In a cramped apartment overlooking the ancient streets where emperors once walked in triumph, Donyale Luna, the woman who had shattered fashion's color barrier and redefined beauty itself, took her final breath at 33. The needle that ended her life was both instrument and symbol. The same precision that had made her the most photographed black woman in the world had become the tool of her destruction. The discovery sent ripples through a fashion industry that had simultaneously celebrated and abandoned her. Here was the face that had graced the cover of British Vogue in 1966, becoming the first black model to claim that coveted throne. The woman who had worked with Salvador Dalí, Andy Warhol, and Federico Fellini, who had transformed from Detroit runaway to international icon, now lay silent in a city that had promised artistic sanctuary but delivered only deeper isolation. The official cause was heroin overdose, but those who knew Luna understood that she had been dying long before the drugs found her. "They made me into a goddess," she had written in her diary. But no one asked if I was happy. The apartment where she died was filled with her paintings, sketches, and the elaborate costumes she created for the multiple personas she inhabited. Evidence of a brilliant mind that had never found peace in any single identity. As news of her death spread through the networks of photographers, designers, and artists who had built careers around her otherworldly beauty, one question echoed through every conversation. Was this the inevitable fate of someone who had dared to exist as herself in an industry that demanded she be everything to everyone while remaining nothing to herself? But Donyale's story was never just about fashion. It was about a woman who had been running from herself since childhood, who had created elaborate fantasies to escape unbearable realities, and who had discovered that fame was just another form of hiding. The goddess the world had worshipped was revealed to be as fragile and human as anyone else. But by then it was too late to save the woman who had been lost inside the image. Was this really an accident? Or had the fashion world simply discarded her when she was no longer useful? To understand how it all ended in that Roman apartment, we must first understand how it began in the poverty and violence of Detroit, where a young girl named Peggy Ann Freeman learned that survival meant becoming someone else entirely. In the industrial wasteland of Detroit in 1945, where assembly lines churned out the machinery of American prosperity while black families remained locked out of its benefits, Peggy Ann Freeman was born into a world that would spend her entire life telling her she didn't belong. The daughter of Nathaniel Freeman, a factory worker whose dreams had been crushed by systematic racism, and Peggy Evans, a woman who cleaned white people's houses while her own children learned to fend for themselves, the future Donyale Luna entered existence already marked as an outsider. The Freeman household was a battlefield where poverty and frustration exploded into violence that would scar Peggy Ann in ways that fame would never heal. Her father's rage at a world that refused to recognize his humanity was directed inward, toward the family that represented both his greatest love and his most painful reminder of what the system had denied him. Each beating, each moment of terror, taught Peggy Ann that safety lay in becoming invisible, in transforming herself into whatever would make the violence stop. But the same brutality that broke something essential inside her also gave birth to the survival mechanism that would define her entire life: the ability to become someone else entirely. Even as a child, neighbors recalled, Peggy Ann would disappear into elaborate fantasies, telling people she was a princess from Africa or Mexico, creating stories so detailed and convincing that even she seemed to believe them. The transformation began early. By age 12, she had grown to an extraordinary height that made her a target for cruel jokes and convinced her that her body was another form of punishment. But the same physical characteristics that made her feel like a freak in Detroit would later make her irresistible to photographers seeking something unprecedented in beauty. The angular features that seemed alien in her neighborhood would become the face that launched a revolution in fashion. School offered no refuge from the chaos at home. In classrooms where teachers expected nothing from black students and textbooks contained no images that reflected her experience, Peggy Ann learned that education was another system designed to convince her of her own worthlessness. She retreated further into fantasy, spending hours drawing surrealist creatures and writing poetry that revealed a mind capable of extraordinary artistic vision trapped in circumstances that offered no outlet for such gifts. Could these early experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs and tragedies? The evidence was written in every elaborate lie she would later tell about her origins, every persona she would create to avoid confronting the pain of her authentic history. The girl who learned to survive by becoming other people was preparing for a career that would demand she be everything except herself. The escape came in the form of rebellion that looked like self-destruction, but was actually the first step toward a different kind of life. At 16, Peggy Ann began frequenting Detroit's underground art scene, where her otherworldly appearance and mysterious stories about her exotic heritage made her the center of attention she had never received at home or school. Here, among bohemian artists and jazz musicians, being different was an asset rather than a liability. The transformation accelerated when she met David McCabe, a photographer who recognized something extraordinary in her angular beauty and encouraged her to model for experimental portraits that would later find their way to New York agencies. But even as she discovered her power to mesmerize cameras, Peggy Ann was already learning to dissociate from the image being created around her, to treat her reflection as a separate person who could absorb all the attention and judgment while her authentic self remained safely hidden. Each photograph was both step toward freedom and deeper imprisonment in a performance that would eventually consume the person creating it. The girl who had learned to become invisible to survive violence at home was discovering that visibility came with its own forms of danger, its own requirements for self-erasure. But escape from Detroit seemed worth any price, even if that price was the gradual disappearance of whoever Peggy Ann Freeman had been before the cameras found her. The journey from Detroit runaway to New York sensation unfolded like a fever dream, as the girl who had been nobody became someone extraordinary while remaining convinced she was still nothing at all. By 1964, at 19, the woman now calling herself Donyale Luna had arrived in Manhattan with nothing but invented stories about her past, and a face that made experienced photographers stop in their tracks and reach for their cameras. The transformation of identity was complete and terrifying. Peggy Ann Freeman officially disappeared, replaced by an exotic creature who claimed to be the daughter of a Mexican diplomat and an Indian princess, whose accent seemed to shift depending on the story she was telling, whose very existence seemed to challenge every assumption about who was allowed to be beautiful in America. The modeling agencies that saw her pictures couldn't categorize what they were looking at, but they knew it was something the industry had never seen before. The breakthrough came through David Bailey, the legendary British photographer whose eye for unconventional beauty had already revolutionized fashion photography. When Bailey saw Luna's portfolio, he didn't see a black model trying to break into an exclusively white industry. He saw something that transcended racial categories entirely, a face that belonged in surrealist paintings rather than traditional fashion spreads. The collaboration they created would change everything while destroying the woman who made it possible. The 1966 British Vogue cover that made Donyale Luna the first black model to grace that magazine's front page was both breakthrough and breakdown, the moment when centuries of exclusion finally cracked while simultaneously creating new forms of pressure that no human being could sustain. The image showed Luna's face painted with geometric designs that made her look like an African goddess reimagined by Picasso, her eyes staring directly at the camera with an expression that seemed to see through the lens into the souls of everyone who would ever look at the photograph. The reaction was immediate and seismic. In an America still convulsing through the civil rights movement, where black women were systematically excluded from mainstream beauty standards, Here was a dark-skinned model claiming the most coveted space in international fashion. The image became a symbol of revolution to some, an assault on natural order to others, and for Luna herself, the beginning of a performance she would never be allowed to stop giving. But the same breakthrough that made her famous also trapped her in a role that demanded she be a symbol, rather than a person, a representative of her race rather than an individual with her own complexities and contradictions. Every interview required her to speak for all Black women. Every photograph carried the weight of challenging centuries of prejudice. Every public appearance was scrutinized for what it meant about the changing nature of American beauty standards. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? The evidence was accumulating in Luna's increasing discomfort with questions about her racial identity, her growing tendency to create elaborate backstories that avoided any connection to African American heritage, and her apparent belief that being seen as exotic was safer than being seen as authentically Black in an industry that had no template for treating dark-skinned women as human beings rather than political statements. The collaboration with Andy Warhol at the factory provided both artistic fulfillment and deeper descent into the kind of performance that was consuming whatever remained of her authentic self. Warhol understood that Luna was herself a work of art, a living sculpture who had transformed her own identity into something unprecedented and unsustainable. He filmed her, photographed her, and surrounded her with other beautiful broken people who had learned that visibility was both salvation and damnation. The factory became Luna's second home, a place where being artificial was expected rather than criticized, where everyone was performing versions of themselves for cameras that never stopped rolling. Here she could be the exotic princess, the mysterious goddess, the surrealist muse without anyone questioning the psychological cost of never being allowed to simply exist as the woman beneath all those personas. But even Warhol, who had built his career on exploring the relationship between authentic identity and public image, seemed unaware of how thoroughly Luna was disappearing into the characters she created. Each successful photograph was making her more famous and more lost. Each artistic collaboration another step away from any possibility of discovering who she might have been if she had been allowed to exist as herself, rather than as everyone else's fantasy about what a beautiful Black woman should represent. Behind all that revolutionary success, was there already a woman desperately trying to find some solid ground in an identity that had become completely fluid, completely dependent on external validation from people who loved the image while remaining completely uninterested in the person creating it? The goddess they worshipped was already dying, even as her fame reached heights that previous generations of Black models could never have imagined possible. The late 1960s brought Donyale Luna to international prominence and personal dissolution, as she became the face of a generation's changing attitudes about race and beauty, while battling demons that success only made more powerful and more dangerous. The contracts with major fashion houses, the collaborations with legendary photographers, the appearances in avant-garde films, each achievement was both artistic triumph and evidence of how completely she had become a product for consumption by people who had no investment in her survival beyond her usefulness to their projects. The relationship with Salvador Dalí epitomized both the heights of her artistic recognition and the depths of her psychological exploitation. The surrealist master saw in Luna something that perfectly embodied his vision of beauty that transcended rational categories. A living artwork that challenged conventional perception while suggesting new possibilities for aesthetic experience. He declared her a living sculpture and the most beautiful woman who ever lived, praise that should have been liberating but instead created new pressures to maintain a level of perfection that no human being could sustain indefinitely. For Dalí, Luna was not just a model but a muse in the most dangerous sense. A woman whose existence was valued primarily for its ability to inspire creativity in others, rather than for any inherent worth she possessed as an individual. The paintings and photographs they created together were masterpieces that helped establish Luna's reputation as more than just a fashion model, but they also reinforced her sense that her value was completely dependent on other people's artistic visions rather than her own desires or ambitions. The film work with Federico Fellini and Satyricon represented another form of artistic recognition that came with psychological costs Luna was unprepared to pay. Fellini cast her not because of her acting ability but because of her otherworldly presence, her ability to embody the kind of mysterious beauty that his surrealist vision required. But being valued for qualities beyond her control, her height, her features, her capacity to look simultaneously ancient and futuristic, reinforced the message that her authentic personality was irrelevant to her professional success. Each collaboration with legendary artists was both career milestone and reminder that Luna was expected to be a beautiful object, rather than a creative collaborator, an inspiration for other people's genius rather than a person with artistic ambitions of her own. The sculptures she created, the poems she wrote, the paintings she produced in private were dismissed as hobbies by an industry that preferred to see her as a natural phenomenon rather than a trained artist with her own vision and voice. The fashion work that paid her bills required constant performance of exotic otherness that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. As drug use began to blur the lines between the personas she created and whatever remained of her authentic self. The same chemicals that initially helped her access the otherworldly states that cameras loved were gradually making it impossible for her to exist as anyone other than the character she played for public consumption. Behind all that glamour was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. The evidence was mounting in her increasing reliance on drugs to achieve the mental states that her work required, in her growing difficulty maintaining relationships with people who knew her before she became famous, and in her apparent awareness that the career providing artistic recognition and financial security was making emotional stability impossible to achieve. The jet-setting lifestyle that took her from New York to London to Paris to Rome was both evidence of her international success and contributor to the rootlessness that made authentic relationships nearly impossible to develop or maintain. Each city offered new opportunities to reinvent herself, new audiences who knew only the public version of her story, new possibilities for escaping whatever pain was driving her constant need to be someone other than who she actually was. The interviews from this period revealed someone who was simultaneously at the peak of her influence and the depths of her confusion about who she actually was beneath all the personas she had created. "I don't want to be black or white," she said in one famous quote. "I want to be me." But the tragedy was that the industry that had made her famous had no interest in allowing her to discover what being herself might actually mean. Each successful year was making her more celebrated and more lost. Each fashion magazine cover another step away from any possibility of authentic self-knowledge or genuine human connection. The beautiful outsider who had broken fashion's color barrier was learning that inclusion in an exploitative system was just another form of exclusion from the human experience she desperately needed, but was never allowed to access. The 1970s brought Luna to a crossroads that would determine whether she could find a way to maintain her career while preserving her sanity, or whether the increasing pressure to embody everyone else's fantasies would ultimately destroy the woman who had made those fantasies possible. The fashion industry was evolving in ways that made her particular aesthetic both timeless and increasingly difficult to market to audiences that were demanding different relationships with beauty and celebrity. The rise of more conventional black models like Beverly Johnson, who projected warmth and accessibility rather than Luna's mysterious otherworldliness, suggested that the industry was ready for diversity, but only on terms that were less challenging to existing power structures. Luna's refusal to be categorized, her insistence on existing as something unprecedented rather than as a representative of any particular group, was beginning to seem like a liability rather than an asset to clients who preferred symbols they could easily understand and control. The marriage to Luigi Casanica, an Italian photographer and artist, represented both attempt to find stability and recognition that her identity had become so fluid that even intimate relationships were forms of performance. The wedding was both romantic culmination and business partnership, a collaboration between two people who had learned to commodify their own lives for artistic and commercial purposes, but who had never developed the skills necessary for genuine emotional intimacy. The daughter who was born from this union should have provided the grounding that Luna had never experienced, the reason to develop an authentic self that could exist independently of cameras and artistic collaborators. But motherhood also created new pressures as Luna struggled to be present for her child, while maintaining the career that supported their lifestyle, and that had become the only identity she knew how to inhabit successfully. Each attempt to create a normal family life was complicated by the fact that Luna had no model for what normal looked like, no experience with the kind of stability that might have allowed her to be simply a mother, rather than a performing version of motherhood that could be photographed and celebrated by people who had no investment in her actual happiness or her child's well-being. The move to Rome was intended as escape from the fashion industry's pressures, a chance to focus on her own artistic work while raising her daughter in an environment that valued creativity over commercial success. But the same qualities that had made Luna valuable to photographers and directors, her capacity for reinvention, her comfort with performance, her ability to embody other people's fantasies, made it difficult for her to develop the kind of consistent identity that successful parenting required. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The increasing drug use that had initially been a professional tool for accessing the mental states her work required was becoming a necessity for basic functioning as the gap between public success and private despair continued to widen. Each day required more chemicals to achieve the personality that people expected, more substances to bridge the distance between who she was supposed to be and whoever she actually was beneath all the performance. The artistic community in Rome welcomed Luna as a celebrity and fellow creative spirit, but few people understood the psychological crisis she was experiencing or were equipped to provide the kind of support that might have helped her develop a sustainable relationship with her own identity. The same bohemian atmosphere that made Rome attractive as an escape from commercial fashion also made it easier to access the drugs that were gradually making any escape from performance impossible. Each party, each artistic collaboration, each attempt to create meaningful work was increasingly dependent on chemicals that provided temporary relief from the anxiety and depression that success had created, but that ultimately made those problems more severe and less manageable. The woman who had spent her entire adult life helping other people create beautiful images was losing the ability to see herself as anything other than raw material for other people's artistic visions. Behind all that apparent retreat from commercial fashion, was there a woman finally trying to save herself from forces that had been consuming her since she was 19? Or was the isolation just creating new opportunities for the self-destructive behaviors that fame had both enabled and required? The final years of Donyale Luna's life unfolded like a slow-motion tragedy, as she attempted to balance the demands of motherhood with the psychological costs of a career built on performing identities that had no connection to whatever authentic self might have survived decades of systematic erasure. Each day required choosing between being present for her daughter and maintaining the chemical equilibrium that made basic social functioning possible, between pursuing her own artistic ambitions and meeting the commercial obligations that supported her family's lifestyle. The Rome of the late 1970s was both sanctuary and trap for someone whose entire identity had been constructed around being unprecedented, impossible to categorize, perpetually in motion between different versions of herself. The city's ancient history and artistic traditions provided inspiration for Luna's own creative work. but they also served as constant reminders of how brief and fragile human lives were compared to the monuments and masterpieces that outlasted their creators. The marriage that had once provided stability was showing signs of strain as Luigi struggled to understand and support a woman battling demons that predated their relationship, and that seemed immune to love, therapy, or any other conventional form of healing. The same otherworldliness that had made Luna attractive as a muse was making her unavailable as a partner and mother, increasingly dependent on drugs not for creative inspiration but for basic emotional regulation. Each argument about family priorities was both relationship conflict and evidence of how thoroughly Luna's career had colonized every aspect of her personal life, making it impossible to separate the woman who wanted to be a good mother from the persona who was contractually obligated to remain mysterious, exotic, and perpetually available for other people's artistic projects. The daughter who should have provided reason to develop an authentic identity instead became another source of guilt and anxiety as Luna recognized that she was recreating the emotional unavailability that had damaged her own childhood. The same survival mechanisms that had helped her escape Detroit poverty were making it impossible to provide the consistent presence that healthy child development required. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? The final interviews Luna gave revealed someone who was trying to find language to describe the experience of living as a series of performances while never developing any stable sense of who she might be when nobody was watching. "I was always running away from myself," she said in one conversation, a statement that was both explanation and admission of defeat. The art she created during this period, sculptures that seemed to be reaching towards some unattainable truth, paintings that depicted figures dissolving into abstract shapes, poems that described the experience of being simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, provided evidence of a brilliant mind that was still capable of profound insight into the human condition, even as it was losing the ability to navigate basic daily existence. But the same sensitivity that made her artistic work compelling also made her increasingly vulnerable to the kind of depression and anxiety that success had created, but that fame made impossible to address through conventional therapeutic means. The woman who had spent decades helping other people create beautiful images was losing the ability to see herself as anything other than a problem to be solved through chemical intervention. The final months brought a series of decisions that suggested someone who was preparing for conclusion rather than continuation. Arrangements for her daughter's care, conversations with friends that felt like attempts at closure rather than maintenance of ongoing relationships. Moments of unexpected clarity about the gap between the life she had lived and the life she had wanted that were too painful for anyone around her to address directly. But the same performance skills that had made her valuable as a model also made it difficult for those who loved her to recognize the severity of her psychological crisis until intervention was no longer possible. The woman who had learned to hide behind beautiful images was dying behind them while everyone continued to see only the goddess they had always worshipped, rather than the human being who desperately needed saving. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation by someone who had finally understood that the only way to stop performing was to stop existing entirely? The morning of January 17, 1979, dawned gray and cold over Rome, the kind of weather that seemed designed for reflection rather than action, for endings rather than beginnings. Donyale Luna spent her final hours in the apartment that had represented both artistic sanctuary and psychological prison, surrounded by the sculptures, paintings, and costumes that provided evidence of a creative spirit that had never found sustainable expression in a world that preferred to consume rather than nurture artistic genius. The decision she made that morning was both surrender and rebellion, both acknowledgement of defeat and refusal to continue participating in a performance that had provided everything except the authentic existence she had been seeking since childhood. She had spent 15 years being the exotic goddess, the mysterious muse, the beautiful symbol of changing attitudes about race and beauty. But she had never been allowed to simply be whoever Peggy Ann Freeman might have become if she had been born into different circumstances. The needle that ended her life was loaded with the same chemical that had made performance possible for years. But this time the dosage was calculated to provide permanent rather than temporary relief from the anxiety and depression that fame had created. The apartment that had promised artistic freedom became the final stage for a performance that nobody was meant to witness, the ultimate act of a woman who had learned that visibility was just another form of imprisonment. The discovery of her body revealed the full scope of the artistic vision that commercial success had never allowed her to develop fully. Walls covered with surrealist paintings that depicted figures transforming into abstract shapes. Sculptures that seemed to be reaching towards some unattainable truth. Notebooks filled with poetry that described the experience of living as a series of personas while never developing any authentic sense of self. When news of her death reached the fashion and art communities that had built careers around her image, the responses revealed how little anyone had understood about the psychological costs of the visibility they had provided. The same people who had celebrated her as a revolutionary figure were shocked to discover that revolution had required sacrifices they had never been asked to acknowledge or address. The funeral was both celebration of artistic achievement and recognition of collective failure. As friends and collaborators who had loved Luna's image struggled to articulate what they had known about the woman behind it. The eulogies were filled with praise for her artistic contributions and professional breakthroughs, but they also revealed how successfully she had hidden her emotional struggles from people who had worked with her for years. Salvador Dalí, who had declared her the most beautiful woman who ever lived, sent flowers but could not explain why such beauty had been unable to sustain the life that had created it. Andy Warhol, who had understood better than anyone the relationship between authentic identity and public performance, remained silent about the death of someone who had embodied the dangers of that relationship more completely than any of his other factory collaborators. The daughter left behind would grow up with the burden of understanding that her mother had been simultaneously celebrated and destroyed by the same cultural forces, that the fame which had provided financial security had also made emotional stability impossible to achieve. The inheritance included both artistic legacy and cautionary tale about the costs of allowing other people's fantasies to become more important than one's own authentic needs and desires. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? The fashion industry that had celebrated Luna as a pioneer continued to profit from her image while refusing to examine the systemic problems that had made her destruction inevitable. The same magazines that had featured her breakthrough covers ran memorial spreads that celebrated her contributions while avoiding any discussion of the psychological support systems that might have prevented her tragedy. The question remains whether Luna's death was the inevitable result of personal demons, or evidence of an industry that created impossible conditions for the people whose beauty it exploited for commercial and artistic purposes. The woman who had taught the world that beauty could transcend racial categories had learned that transcendence itself could become a prison when it was the only identity available to someone who desperately needed to exist as a complete human being rather than a beautiful symbol. She had lived as art, died as tragedy, and left behind a legacy that continues to influence fashion photography while raising uncomfortable questions about whether such influence was worth the price she was ultimately required to pay. The apartment where she died has been converted into other purposes, but the images she created continue to circulate through the global networks of fashion and art that had simultaneously elevated and destroyed her. The beautiful outsider who had broken fashion's color barrier had learned that breaking barriers was just the beginning of a performance that would continue until someone found the courage to stop performing entirely. But by then, the woman who might have chosen a different ending was already lost inside the goddess everyone else needed her to remain. and the only escape from that divine imprisonment was the ultimate disappearance that fame had been preparing her for since she first learned that survival meant becoming someone else entirely.